Hey everyone, welcome to Toast and Topics.
If you haven't already done so already, this is a reminder to rate and share our podcast. Your input has really helped us to connect with new listeners, and we really appreciate all that you've done to grow our show thus far.
This week we have another really exceptional guest from our very own Dartmouth College, economics professor Maddie McKelway. Prior to joining Dartmouth, Professor McKelway was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford's King Center on Global Development. She received her PhD in economics from MIT in 2020 and now focuses on research in the field of development economics, studying the empowerment and employment of women in India. Professor McKelway, welcome to the show, and thanks a lot for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, before we dive into your recent work, we'd first love to hear a bit more about your background. Tell us a bit more about how you initially became interested in economics and your path to where you are today.
Yeah, of course. So I grew up in rural Virginia. My parents were doctors, and I was always interested in doing something that would help the world in some way. I considered doing medicine at some point, but then I sort of felt like economics was really where it was at, especially as it related to poverty and being able to help a ton of people through a single policy. And then at the same time, I also just really I did some tutoring in high school and in college, and I really enjoyed teaching. And so then I gradually figured out that being a professor could kind of combine both of those things, because you can do really cool things with your research to inform policy, and also, of course, help if you can the people who are in your study. And then, of course, you're teaching in the rest of your time.
Great. And are you currently teaching any classes at Dartmouth? And what are your initial impressions about Dartmouth and the Upper Valley thus far?
Yes, I'm currently teaching Economics 24, which is development economics. This is my third year teaching this class. I absolutely love teaching it. It's like my dream class to teach. It's exactly the topic I want to teach. It's really fun to introduce students to this area. And then I also try to work in a little bit of economic theory, a little bit of econometrics to help equip them for later classes. And the Upper Valley is really nice as well. It's like a very pleasant place to live. I've gotten to love the winters and the skiing a lot.
You're making me feel nostalgic about my time at Dartmouth. It's great. And so many of your papers focus on India, including your most recent one, which we'll be talking about today. We're curious about how you developed an interest and expertise on that country specifically.
So it started in kind of an embarrassing way, in that when I was in high school, I was obsessed with Indian food. And then I got to college, and there was a study abroad program in India. Of course, it was not just about the food. It was also the courses were all on economic development, which is what I wanted to study and focus on as well. So it was sort of the perfect combination. And so I studied abroad there when I was an undergraduate. I loved it. I find the culture so wildly different than any other place I've been to, and so rich and so fascinating. And I just love going there. And then I got to graduate school, and when you're early on in graduate school, you're working a lot on research projects of your advisors. And all three of my PhD advisors did their research in India. So I got a lot of exposure to India that way. And then the connections that I made to finally start launching my own research portfolio of research projects, they were made thanks to my advisors. And because my advisors know India very well, the connections happen to be in India.
Okay, that's all interesting. And, your research focuses quite a bit on gender issues. And just based off of our understanding, there are a couple of points to underscore here on why India is just such an important place to examine this topic. I mean, number one, female labor force participation in India is relatively low, and women in India often voice more support for female employment than men do. And then number two, marriages in India are often arranged, which means that spouses, especially, in the early stages of a marriage, may not know each other well and may face high bargaining costs. And so I'm curious if you could comment a bit on that.
Yeah, absolutely. India indeed has one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world. And researchers in recent years and policymakers too have been starting to notice this, and this topic has gotten a lot of attention. It sort of fell on my lap by accident, in the sense that one of my advisors in graduate school put me in touch with the chairperson of this company. It's one of India's biggest carpet manufacturers, and they were trying to hire women, or they would train women to be carpet weavers, and then they would hire them in carpet weaving. And they were working in rural Uttar Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh is one of the poorest states in India, and it's also has some of the highest levels of gender inequality. And one thing that really stood out to me is they're offering this job to women. These women are, for the most part, don't have jobs already. They're extremely poor households. Like it's hard to just convey how poor these households are. And so you would think they could really, really use the extra money. And something that, that resonates to all parents is investing in your children. So they could really use the extra money to invest in their children's health and nutrition, and education. Yet the cultural barriers to women working in this setting are just so strong that when the firm goes in and opens these new centers to try to hire women, they just have a very difficult time getting women to take up the job and getting women to stay in the job. So this sort of problem became really fascinating to me, both the cultural aspect of it and the potential to really transform the lives of these households if you could solve this problem and double household income.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And in that vein, communication is a major theme of your work, particularly as it relates to female employment and getting women into these kinds of jobs. And so could you talk a bit about the communication side of this and how communication can be used to improve women's lives and livelihoods kind of at a, high level?
Yeah, of course. So one thing that's really interesting in this setting is we typically imagine women who are living in this sort of environment as being extremely passive, as sort of life kind of happens to them. They're born, their parents choose who they're going to marry, they get married to this person, they generally don't know the person very well at all. They move to his village, and then basically he or his in-laws decide most of the day-to-day decisions throughout the rest of the woman's life. And we typically imagine women in this setting as being very passive. But when you talk to women who live in this setting, that's not really their experience. And often this idea of passiveness comes from the dynamics in the household, that it's always up to the husband or always up to his parents what decisions are going to be made. But in fact, when you talk to the women, a lot of them have these sort of sneaky things they do to try to get their way in the household. So they don't have, a lot of objective power. This isn't a culture or an environment where they could insist that they get their way. It's not an environment where they could even threaten to leave the marriage if they don't get their way. So instead, they come up with these sneaky forms of communication to try to get their way. So for instance, they'll only ask their husband for something they want when he's in a good mood. Or maybe they'll make him his favorite food for dinner before they ask him, or they'll make him a cup of tea before they ask him. And then they talk about using tones of voice. They say, sadly, I don't speak Hindi, but I'm told from my team that they say they're talking with love. So they change their tone of voice when they're asking for these sorts of things. So I became really fascinated in this because we typically think of women in this setting as being very passive, but yet this sort of soft power that they have could be really important for determining their household outcomes and also for their own well-being.
That's all really interesting. So I guess let's just tie this all back to your latest working paper, which we want to introduce, The Power of Persuasion, Causal Effects of Household Communication on Women's Employment. So, with all of this in mind, could you summarize what you were investigating and kind of how you went about it?
Yes, of course. So we were basically trying to study these techniques that women use and try to test whether they can be successful for changing major household decisions. So in our case, we were focused on the decision of women's labor supply. Of course, when you start to actually implement this, you have to choose a particular form of communication that you're going to focus on. We didn't feel like this was, so a lot of questions of this nature increasingly in economics are being answered in lab environments or lab in the field environments. But this sort of communication, private communication between a husband and a wife, was not something that was going to lend itself well to a lab environment, because those are not the sort of conversations you want to have when other people are listening, and not the sort of conversations that can be had in 5 minutes. So instead, we went with another approach, which is called a field experiment, where you actually offer people a real intervention, in this case, to try to improve their communication skills. So we partnered with a group of an NGO called Corestone. They've now changed their name to Wellbeing, but they're run by psychologists who offer programs in psychology in India and in other developing countries. And they were interested in developing a curriculum for us in effective communication.
Right.
And so they developed that for our setting. And then we randomized whether women were given this training, and then we look at effects on their labor supply.
Okay, that's a very helpful overview. And there are a lot of different things to unpack here. But the first thing that really has struck me about this study that you conducted is that when I was reading a lot of economics papers in undergrad, I often thought of economic research as being something, that wasn't necessarily done in the field. It involved big data sets that, for example, were supplied by organizations like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that kind of thing. It's really cool to hear that you were doing, a lot of this research with real people. And I was wondering if you could talk about what that whole, experience was like.
Oh, yeah. So it's wonderful. So you're definitely right that most economics research is probably not of this flavor. But in development economics, this is becoming very, very common to answer questions by actually collecting your own data or actually running your own interventions and evaluating them that way. I personally absolutely love that. I don't know if I would like my job if I didn't do field experiments and I were just working with publicly available data, because it's amazing to be in a totally different setting and learn about the setting, but then also imagine that you could actually be doing something that would help other people.
That makes sense. And, in your paper, you had discussed something called the see, feel, want communication strategy. And you had talked about this a little bit earlier, but, could you elaborate a little bit on that and how it affected outcomes?
Yeah, of course. So this NGO that we collaborated with to design this intervention, they were building an intervention in what psychologists call assertive communication, which formally is just a bunch of tools to help people convey their preferences in a way that's still respectful to other people. Now, in the literature, there are tons and tons of models for how to implement these sorts of things, these sorts of assertive communication tools. But the NGO we were working with has lots and lots of experience in this sort of setting. And the tools that have been developed in the literature are usually implemented in developed countries where people are educated. And we were trying to implement it in a totally different setting where most people have very, very little education. Most people are not able to read and write. So they combined and developed these different tools into what they called a see, feel, want statement. So the way they taught women to communicate assertively in our training was, well, when you need to communicate assertively, you do this in 3 steps. The first step is see. So you describe objectively how you see the situation. Feel is the next step, and there you describe the emotions you're feeling around the situation. But the important piece here is that you use the word I and not the word you. So perhaps unsurprisingly, it's going to go much better if you're talking to your husband and you say, I'm feeling upset about this, than if you say, you're making me feel upset about this. So that's the second part, feel. And then the last part is want, where you just say what it is that you want. So in the context, if you were a woman trying to persuade your husband that you should work outside of the home, this might go as follows. You might say, expenses are rising and it's getting really hard to support a family on just a single income. And I think it would be really nice if we could pay for tutoring for our children. I'm feeling pretty anxious about this situation and would really like to do something about it. And so I think maybe I could start working outside of the home so we could earn a bit of extra money to pay for the children's tutoring. Something like that would be the implementation of the see, feel, want statement. So that was the intervention sort of built up to that. As you might imagine, for people who cannot read, cannot write, have very, very little education, there are a lot of prerequisite concepts you need to build up to teaching them the see, feel, want statement. So that was there. So the earlier sessions, for instance, talked about emotions. So what is an emotion? How can you convey your emotions to other people? How do you manage your emotions, etc.? So things like that were built up in the early sessions. And then in the later sessions, this technique was taught and practiced.
Interesting. That's a great overview. And among the women who received this kind of training, what sorts of outcomes did you see for them in terms of things like job applications or engagement at work or earnings, things of that sort?
Great question. So the first thing I should say, of course, this was a randomized trial. So the outcomes that we're looking at are comparing the women who got this training to women who are assigned to a control group. And we're looking at, the first step is to confirm that women actually learned something from this training. And we do, in fact, see that's the case. The women report that they would use these sorts of assertive communication techniques more than women in the control group. So then turning to the main outcome, which is labor supply. So one really nice thing about this setting, I mentioned earlier that I'd been working with this large carpet company. So this project was done in the setting where the carpet company operates, and we timed it such that the treatment was given just before new jobs for women were going to open. So the women in our study were women who would be eligible. Then we run this intervention, and then finally the jobs become available. And because we have this partnership with the firm, we can get all of this great data on whether the women actually apply for the program, whether they participate in the program, what their earnings are like, et cetera. So looking at that, the first thing to mention is that, as you noted earlier on, we're looking at labor supply because in this setting, it's very common for women to be more interested in their own employment than their husbands are. So the way our sample breaks down is generally at baseline, about half of women said they and their husbands felt the same way. And in the other half, it was the case that the women said they were more interested in working outside the home than their husbands. So we look at effects for the whole sample, but also for these two different subgroups, with the hypothesis that if you're in agreement with your husband, communication skills shouldn't have an effect. But if you want to work and he doesn't, improving your communication skills should make you more likely to work outside of the home. And that's in fact what we find. So if you just pool all of the data together and just compare treatment and control women, we see positive but insignificant effects on most labor supply outcomes. But if you split by these preferences, we see very strong effects for women who at baseline were facing opposition to their employment from their husbands. So for these women, the communication training made them more likely to apply for the program. It made them attend more days of the program, and it also ultimately made them earn more money from the program. And in terms of magnitudes, these effects are pretty large. They're, I want to say, on the order of like a 40% increase in these outcomes.
Wow. And with that, looking to the future a bit, given how important communication is to female employment outcomes, is there anything that policymakers can do to ensure that households are either implementing or enforcing more effective communication strategies? And if so, what could those be?
Great question. So one thing to say, so our intervention was a one-time intervention. So it was 6 sessions over 6 weeks, and then it was done. And so in addition, the results I just cited you were sort of pooled across all of the time periods that we have data on. But if you start to split things up by time period, you start to see that effects fade out. So after several months, women have a lot of their memory of the see, feel, want concept has faded. The effects on their use of these techniques has faded, as well as the effects on their labor supply. So I think the first thing is that if you wanted to implement this as a policy, you would probably need to find a way to do it in a more ongoing way. So you probably wouldn't want to maybe you would do an initial 6 sessions like we did, but then maybe you would follow it up with booster sessions. So every month, let's say you go back to the women and remind them of what you had taught them, see if they have any questions about using it, etc. So then that sort of lends itself nicely to the idea of trying to launch this policy at scale, because if you imagine launching it at scale, a natural way to do that would be to try to combine it with some sort of institution that already exists where women gather and women meet. So one option would be women's self-help groups. These are basically like savings clubs that many women in rural India participate in. And you could imagine delivering the intervention in those groups. And that would be very scalable, because a lot of the cost of our intervention was just gathering the women, setting up the meeting in the first place. And so if you're already working in an environment where the women are already gathering, you can save a lot of the implementation costs that way. And then in addition, since that's an ongoing thing, self-help groups meet monthly, you could maybe generate longer lasting effects.
Okay, I see. So to take a step back here, your research is focused quite a bit on how women can change their communication strategies to improve outcomes. But as Sachin and I were reading through your work as males, it sort of occurred to us that it might also be useful to think about how, males in India, in this audience, can adjust their own communication strategies to improve gender equality and to also promote opportunities for women. Do you have any thoughts on this subject?
It's a great question, a really big question, and something I should say I am not at all equipped to answer, because the project that I did only evaluated the effects of training for women, so I of course can't say how things would go if you trained men instead. But I think I guess a couple things. So a lot of these techniques for assertive communication could totally be used by men in the same way. And a big piece of the assertive techniques is not just conveying what you want, but doing it in a way that's respectful to other people. And so that element means that basically if you train women, if you train men in communication skills, both of them will benefit, because the person who's using the skills might be more likely to get what they want, but they're going to be doing it in a more respectful way to the other person. disagreements might become less likely, etc. So I think that's one thing. And then it's hard to say much more beyond that without, of course, running a randomized trial. But I think in general, oftentimes women are maybe a little more hesitant to speak up and to voice their own ideas and their own opinions. And so to the extent that, women, of course, should feel more comfortable doing that, but to the extent that men can be more welcoming of that behavior on the part of women, I think that would also be great.
That's great insight. Thank you.
Of course.
And one final question for you, completely unrelated to what we've talked about, is for all of your current students at Dartmouth, what is your biggest piece of advice for them, especially those that might be interested in pursuing a career in economics?
Oh, great question. So, well, it would depend on, there's so many things you can do with economics that it would depend a little bit on what they would want to do. If they wanted to go into finance or consulting, I would tell them to talk to someone other than me, because that's not I don't have much expertise there. But certainly if you are interested in pursuing a career in economics, or in development economics, or especially in research, I think a couple suggestions. So if you want to go to economics grad school, you've got to take a lot of math. That's something that people often don't realize later on into their undergraduate studies, and then they end up having to take math classes after graduating before they can even apply. So that's one thing. Look into the math requirements and make sure you're on top of those. Then I think getting involved in research, if you're interested in economics research, is a great thing to do. And at Dartmouth, unlike other schools, there are so many opportunities for undergraduates to get involved in faculty research. So we don't have PhD students here. We don't have master's students. So if we have students involved in our research, they're undergraduates. So there are tons of opportunities to do that. If you're interested in doing that, I would strongly recommend getting involved in the DERS program, which is the Dartmouth Economic Research Scholars Program. It's a great program. And the other tip I'd give you is you should, of course, be working for the professor whose research interests you the most. And if your interests change, you should definitely, change professors and feel totally comfortable exploring research in different ways. But as soon as you get a sense that this is what you might want to be doing, I think the sorts of things you can do as an undergraduate research assistant get better and better the more time you spend with the faculty member. So if you are interested in working on a project, you are pretty certain this is the field you want to do. If you commit to working for more terms rather than just one at a time, you'll end up getting much more deep into the project and learning much more about it than if you just work for the sorts of things you would do for just one term, are more superficial than if you work for longer. You'll often get involved in the data work itself, which can be quite rewarding and quite educational.
Well, thank you so much, Professor McKelway, for taking the time to speak with us today. This is really interesting work, and we're really glad we got to discuss it live with you. And, best of luck in everything moving forward.
Thank you. Best of luck to you too.
Thank you. Well, we'll see you all again soon, where we will have Kyle Mullins, a friend of ours and now a full-time journalist at Forbes, talk about his original reporting on the finances of the 2024 presidential candidates. Until then. Thanks for listening to this episode of Toast and Topics. Before signing off, we wanted to disclose that the views expressed in this podcast are not representative of the organizations that we are associated with. If you learned something in this episode, please share it with a friend or leave us a review. Until next time.